All right, so our next speaker is Olivier Oullier, who is currently the co-founder and the CEO of Inclusive Brain, but he's also engaged as chairman as the Institute for Artificial Intelligence by Biotech Dental, and he's also a professor of behavior and brain science at the University of Aix-Marseille. So I will leave the floor to you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's good to be back here. Few elements of disclosure first. My name is Olivier. I'm a scientist. And as such, what I'm going to share with you is my very partial view of things. It's my opinion. I have a bunch of beliefs, like most scientists should have, or at least should disclose. The main ones are that I think that absence of bias does not exist, neutrality does not exist, independence does not exist, and objectivity does not exist. Hence, I insist what I'm going to share with you is my very partial view of things. However, what I think exists is rigorous methods. And this is what I'm obsessed with. Two things, rigorous methods and outcomes. What I would like to share with you today is a journey that took me from academia to non-invasive brain-computer interfaces in the market. But I want to give you a gift, for starters, because it's always about give and take. I want to share with you the ultimate technology that has allowed us for decades to understand everything about the human brain and the human behavior. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it exists. And this technology, we'll know it, is surveys, questionnaires, focus groups, declarative methods, right? There is not a single public or private organization that is not relying on these kind of instruments. I'm not going to even call them methodology or science, because that would be an insult for the rest of science, where basically there is this basic assumption that if you ask people questions, first, they're going to give you the truth, and second, they have access to the motives of their behaviors. Despite more than 45 years of peer-reviewed scientific literature that has illustrated the lack of replicability, the lack of rigor, the lack of predictability of these methods, they are still being used widely. This said, I'm not anti-declarative methods. I'm anti the fact that we use them, period, not in conjunction with other methodologies in order to understand us, the most complex living creature on the planet, not to mention with all its interactions. So the very first thing I would like to call for is for respect. I think the human brain is the least respected organ that we have. Let me bring you back to 4 years, when a pandemic hit the planet. Imagine if that pandemic was not a biological pandemic related to a virus, but imagine if it were a cardiovascular epidemic, cardiovascular problems. Do you remember in your organizations, again, public or private, what happened right when COVID hit? With the best intentions at heart, most leaders reach out to find solutions in order to understand how their employees feel. Mood meters, questionnaires, self-proclaimed wellness, happiness experts, etc., etc. Most of these methods were based on a bunch of surveys or, at best, sliders on a scale from 0 to 10, how do you feel? On a scale from 0 to 10, how stressed do you think you are? Totally oblivious to the fact that there is a massive gap between what our brain is experiencing and what we're able to share. And sometimes we can't even sense what is happening in our bodies. So now imagine if it were not coronavirus, but heart diseases. And if all these leaders in organizations had circulated surveys asking, on a scale from 0 to 10, how clogged are your arteries? On a scale from 0 to 10, how tired is your heart? then use these results and provide you with a nice deck or a nice seminar to explain to you how to unclog your arteries, how, you know, for your heart to be stronger. Who would have accepted that? Who would have accepted that we would talk about the human heart without measuring it, without relying on people who have studied, experienced, run experiments on it? No one would have accepted that. Now I have a question for you. Why do we accept that about the human brain and the human behavior? To what extent do we disrespect the human brain that we allow a bunch of people, and I'm going to try to keep calm here and just call them people, to claim they understand us, our complexity, our complex interactions with the world, based on a bunch of questions. Yet, it's everywhere. And at the end of the day, given that there is more than 40 years of peer-reviewed science, the fact that is showing the limits of its methodologies, the fact that some people still rely exclusively on them, is a denial of science. And as a scientist, a very biased scientist, like every scientist, I can't stand that. Now let's move to something a little bit more positive and share with you why it is so complex and what took me to try to understand the links between the human brain, the behavior, how we move, how we make decisions, and ultimately how we can help people with technology and science. The concept of shared dynamics. The fact that there are things that might happen in our brains, in our bodies, that are concomitant to what is happening in our behavior. And one of the hardest things to identify is things that happen at the same time in our brains and that we can measure in our behavior. We spend our time trying to assess, mind guess what is happening in our brains. There are so many beautiful neuroimaging methodologies that provide us images, provide us data to inform us. And we interpret this data. And we make correlations when sometimes there is no correlation, but sometimes there are correlations and causations. And for me, a defining moment, since we're in the most prestigious place for science in France, let's go back to science. This is the not to do in a presentation, this kind of super busy figure from a paper I published in 2006. It's shared dynamics summarizing the work of others. And the work I'm referring to is the work by Armin Fuchs and collaborators in 1992, using magnetoencephalography, MEG, a neuroimaging technique, in order to measure at the same time what is happening in the brain, while the movement of people, movement of fingers, are being recorded. What Fuchs and his collaborators found is that in a simple task that consists in synchronizing or syncopating with an auditory metronome. So imagine a beep, boom, 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 and you ask people either to flex on the beat or to flex in between the beats. And you increase the pace. What happens is if you're tapping on the beat, you can increase the pace and perform quite well at very high frequency, well, higher frequencies. However, if you ask people to tap in between or to flex in between the beats and you increase the metronome, at some point, you're going to switch from syncopation, flexing in between the beats, to flexing on the beat. There is what is called a phase transition. And the incredible work by Fuchs and collaborators shows that at the same time, there is a phase transition that happens in the brain and in the behavior, in the overt motor behavior, measured for the first time. Can seem trivial to a lot of people, but for whomever is interested in the shared dynamics between brain and behavior, this is a seminal study. It changed my life. And those results have been explored and recorded with other methodology, EEG, fMRI. So that's one example where one of very rare examples where the same thing or similar things happen at the same time in the brain and the overt behavior. Another example is in decision making. This is a model that we published 16 years ago. A model of decision making where people have to accept or refuse economic exchanges. It's just decision making. What this model shows that depending on the offer, what you see here is called the saddle node model in maths, and the marble represents where your decision is. And as the environmental conditions change, the valley is less and less deep and deep and deep. And at some point, you switch from refusing to accepting because the environment changes. What is interesting is that if you change the environment in one direction, the switch occurs at a certain point. But now let's look at it from the bottom, which is the reverse. The switch, when you change the parameter back, does not happen at the same time. There is what is called a region of bistability. It's a little bit as if you're on a treadmill, someone is increasing the speed of a treadmill, you're walking, and at some point you switch from walking to running at a certain given speed. And then one slows down the treadmill speed, and you run, and you switch back to walking, except that the switch from walking to running and from running to walking does not occur at the same time. Environmental changes lead to behavioral and brain dynamics changes. Nothing new here, except that we can measure it. So I started with my favorite rant against surveys, questionnaires to understand the brain. But for a long time, it was the only methodology that could be scaled in order to peer inside what is happening in our brains, in our behaviors, our opinions, our sensations. But things have changed. Suddenly, let's make a big leap and go back more than a decade now, when neurotechnology, brain-sensing technology, started to be available outside the scientific and research labs where it was historically used. And full disclosure, I am the founder with Paul Barbast and CEO of Inclusive Brains, the founding chairman of Institute for Artificial Intelligence by Biotech Dental. I'm also a shareholder of a company I was the president of called Emotive, which to date remains the biggest selling portable brain sensing hardware company in the world. And what Emotive did was to take EEG out of a lab. Fun fact, it was founded by an incredible woman, Tan Lee, who at that time had no background whatsoever in science. She was a lawyer. Electroencephalography, for those of you who are not familiar, is a technology that allows to record the microcurrent that is happening in your cortex, the superior part of the body, physically superior. And then you got computation algorithms that allow you to make sense of this data, to interpret it. It used to require a lot of electrodes, shielded environment. What the private sector brought is the fact that you can use this technology not only outside the lab, but now even with movement. The beauty of it was that you start with a lot of electrodes and you do what is called dimensionality reduction. 128 electrodes, then 64, then 16, then 5. How? Because if you train the algorithms with a lot of electrodes and you can pick up principal component analysis, a lot of signal and analysis, you need less and less electrodes to answer some questions. Not all questions, but some questions. Based on a premise that also a technology, as great as it is, can only be useful if people use it. And for people to use it, you need a form factor. And part of the problem was the fact that wearing things on your head was great for science geeks like me to run experiments. But if you really want to bridge, to do this translation from the lab to real life, assuming that life outside the lab is real life, you need a form factor that people can wear. And there are two things that people accept to wear without most issues. One is glasses. The other one is headphones. So we managed, when I was president of Emotive, to release the first brain sensing earbuds called Emanate in 2019. This is bragging time for those of you who follow tech. Apple and Meta released their brain sensing patents in 2023, just saying. That was a commercial release, by the way, and we scaled. Now let's look at a way that we use that. As a neuroscientist, I always dreamt of doing neuroscience outside the lab. And you can see that I got gray hair, so I studied inside the lab. That was my first goal. And by joining Emotive and building on the shoulder of Tanley, Jeff McKellar, Kim Old, brilliant people who made the company what it is, I hope I contributed to the company's growth and innovation. The second thing I was dreaming of was really to be able to record lots and lots and lots of brains, because I come from a generation where we were super happy to record 20 participants in a functional MRI study, which was very costly, complicated, limited, and so time-consuming. So, long story short, we devised in 2020 a global study called Brains versus Virus. We used the fact that Emotive had sold tens of thousands of brain-sensing headsets, earbuds, that were sitting in the homes of people, of researchers, but also people who had them in their home for personal quantification of and biometrics and understanding their physiology, to design a platform that could allow to record thousands of brains at the same time. And we wanted to put it to good use, because for me, science, technology is only good if you can have impact and positive impact with it. So the idea was that lots of governments were putting out messages, public service announcements, information in a rush without testing it. Some was really good, some was not so good. So we wanted to measure whether what people would see, read, or sometimes imagine was triggering, was capturing their attention, was triggering stress in them or not, or calming them down. So that we managed to get information in order to help health authorities around the world, governments, for those who accepted this pro bono work, to better design the messaging and their strategy to communicate with the public in this unprecedented context. That was one use, and for me, goal number 2 achieved, after, thanks to Emotive, being able to do neuroscience outside of the labs. Second, to have a platform that allowed me to collect data at scale, neuroscience data at scale. Is it easy? Does it provide all the answers? Absolutely not. I'm not overclaiming, and I hope I don't overclaim anything here. But there are things we can measure at scale: stress, attention, distraction, sometimes cognitive load, and was really encouraging. However, I wanted to do something else. I got another dream, and this one is really crazy, and I found someone who's crazy enough to jump on that boat with me, Paul Barbas, my co-founder, brilliant young man. My third dream is wearable-less neuroscience. How can we achieve that? Well, first, multimodality. Because as great as the brain is, all the answers are not in the brain. As the progress we've made over the past century now, being able to record brain activity, we still know so little. So what if we can combine the information that we collect in our brain with information that our faces are giving, facial expressions, eye movements, prosody, intonation of a voice, heartbeat, respiration, movements. But we need the tool, we need the tech in order to make sense of all this information. There are companies out there, there are scientists out there who are experts in decoding facial expressions. There are companies that are great with heartbeats. And actually, tech companies, The big tech companies, the Apples, the Googles, the Meta, have released the last generation of wearables that embarked physiological sensors, heartbeats with smartwatches, for example. But this is where what happened over the past 3 to 4 years is just amazing. I heard a lot of people talking about AI and Gen AI, generative AI, as a buzzword. As far as we're concerned with Paul, it's not a buzzword. It's something that has allowed us to achieve at the scientific and the technical level things I'm ashamed to say I was teaching my students 15 years ago to be impossible. Is it magic? Absolutely not. But the processing power, what we can do with the algorithms, is great. Think about it. When we say generative AI today, people think first and foremost ChatGPT, maybe Claude, Gemini, Mistral, but basically a solution that is great at decoding, decrypting, and reconstructing human language, or part of it. It's great, it's amazing. But come on, guys. Human language is only a tiny part of the equation when it comes to human-human interactions and human-machine interactions. If you want to be able to achieve that dream of wearable-less neuroscience, but the bigger dream that is behind, which is for machines to adapt to people, not the other way around, as it is now, we need machines to be trained and to learn the way the brain does. Today, when we buy a computer, when we're sitting behind our workstation, it is us who have to adapt to our work environment. Think about it. I am a scientist turned investor and entrepreneur. My weapon of choice or my workstation is here. It's my computer. I cannot live without my computer. It's pathetic, but that's for another conversation. Yet, it's exactly the same computer that is sold to me, the scientist, that is sold to my butcher, that is sold to a teacher. We have to adapt to the computer. The same with workstations. Whether I'm big, tall, small, whomever I am, I'm expected, if I join a blue-collar work, to sit behind a workstation and to work from 1 hour to another, like 9 to 12, have a break, and then 2 to 5 or more in countries that work more. But we're so different. I love to work for hours, more than 4 hours without anyone talking to me. I like these tunnels. Some people can only focus for 40 minutes. They need a 10-minute break, and then they work for another 40 minutes and a 10-minute break, which is great. But if a person that can only focus for 40 minutes is forced to stay in front of his or her computer for 3 hours, what are the consequences? First, one would say productivity, useless, because you keep the person. But on top of that, you add stress, distress to people. And you can create mental health problems just because you force people to be working in a setting that is not adapted to who they are. And this is very interesting because we accept that for, I would say, office work. We would never accept it on a construction site. I'm 1.8 meters. If my colleague is 1.96 meters and thinner than me, he's not going to be given the same equipment to work on a construction site than me. We have different shoe size, so the shoes are adapted. We have different shoulder width. The clothes are adapted. The helmets. We adapt to the physicality of people. We also need work environments to adapt to how people feel in the moment. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm not the same person on a Monday and a Friday, on a morning and the afternoon. And I'm not talking here about my schizophrenia. I'm just talking about me being human. So this is why we founded Inclusive Brains with Paul. With a dream to leverage neurotechnology, neuroscience, rigorous neuroscience, and artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, in order for machines to adapt to who we are. And when I say who we are, is my physicality, whether I have both my hands working or whether I am in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the neck down. Adapt to who I am, but also how I feel in the moment. Real-time adaptation, closed-loop adaptation. And this is why, as I mentioned, we trained our algorithms with all the information we can find. And we've got what we refer to as cognitive AI agents that are very specialized, that work to analyze facial expression to brainwaves. But what makes them special, and that was not possible without AI and generative AI, is the fact that my cognitive AI agent that is working on decrypting my facial expressions is trained in conjunction with brainwaves. So it's enhanced by what the models can learn from the brainwaves. So that even if I only use the agent that is specialized on facial expression, it has a little bonus compared to others. It's been trained with brainwaves. Not to mention that in the long run, generative AI is not about just generating text. It will be able to generate physiological data that it was trained with. It's actually the case. We can do that. So let me share a few use cases with you. I shared with you a scientific paper that changed entirely the way, as a scientist, and I think as a human being, I see the brain, behavior, and science. And this is thanks to my mentor, Scott Kelso, that I will never thank enough, who accepted me as a postdoc and then is still here guiding or trying to guide me. But I also met incredible people who changed my life. And these are the people I want to talk to you about. So imagine, 10 years ago, I was in the basement of UCLA with my friend Mark Pollock. That was the very first time Mark and I worked on a study where we combine an exoskeleton and brain sensing, portable brain sensing emotive devices, EEG. The idea was to understand whether Mark, who's paralyzed from the waist down and blind, whether the fact that, unlike a lot of people who are paralyzed from the waist down, he benefits from using an exoskeleton. Think about it, that was 2014. On a daily basis, whether his brain is representing locomotor patterns, gait, or anything else different than people who are not stimulated. Can passive walking for people who are paralyzed maintain brain representations? That was our question at the time. So Mark is an explorer, is a technologist, and has a superpower. A superpower that we find in a few other people. One of them we will mention is doing electric cars, space shuttles, brain-computer interface, etc., tunnels, etc. He has the ability to make people who did not work together, to spot technology and science, people who work in isolation, and to envision how they could work together in order to move forward. And this is how Mark had the idea to bring the company that was manufacturing the exoskeleton together with what we were doing with brain sensing devices. We're going to run the follow-up study 10 years after to see how his mental representations have evolved. As that day he passed the mark of 250,000 steps, and now he's walked tens of millions. That was my real first experience combining robotics, exoskeletons, with a brain-computer interface. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because I want to talk to you about a second person that changed my life. And that second person is Rodrigo Mendez. You might not know Rodrigo. You can see Rodrigo in a Formula One race car, a real one, not a simulator, on a real racetrack in Brazil. One tiny detail about Rodrigo, he's quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down. he drove a Formula One up to 80 kilometers per hour thanks to a brain-computer interface. Hands off, sadly for him. A brain-computer interface that cost a few $100 was technology by Emotive and the great work of engineers in Brazil. There was a reality show about that. And the epilogue to this, why do I share that, is because Rodrigo is one of my closest friends, but also without Rodrigo performing this incredible mind control Formula One fit, there would be no inclusive brains. A year after Rodrigo drove a Formula One car with his mind, him and I were invited in Dubai to talk about it. I was supposed to interview Rodrigo in a fireside chat. I have to admit, we didn't do much of our homework. We were just happy to be together and to hang out in Dubai, of all places. Not bad. We didn't know that Lewis Hamilton would be at the conference where we would speak. When we found out that Lewis Hamilton would be there, we pulled a couple of strings and managed not only to meet with him, but for Rodrigo to challenge Lewis Hamilton to a man race. And we were very surprised because Lewis knew about what Rodrigo had achieved. And the video of his challenge that Rodrigo, asked the champ to pick up became viral. And a brilliant young man in France, Paul Barbast, who was building brain-computer interfaces in his student room, saw it, and he reached out to me on LinkedIn. The rest is history. We founded Inclusive Brains together. The thing with Rodrigo is that now people know him for having mind control the Formula One car. But what Rodrigo did is he helped 1.5 million kids with disabilities and teenagers to have access to education, internships, etc. There is an impact to what this person does. And as Rodrigo, Paul and I were having a chat, Rodrigo shared with us something that happened 1 year before the Formula One episode. Rodrigo was an Olympic torch bearer in Rio in 2016. And as Rodrigo shared that story, he told me how proud and happy he was, but also a little bit frustrated because being quadriplegic, someone was pushing his wheelchair and he did not play, in his perception, an active role in the torch relay. Well, that gave us the idea to launch a project called Prometheus BCI that Paul invented, which is a multimodal brain-computer interface that can control an arm, an exoskeleton arm. This exoskeleton arm was used by Nathalie Labrégère, that you see here, on May 9th in Marseille, in order to participate in the Olympic torch relay. And Nathalie, unlike Rodrigo, is not only physically disabled, she also has a cognitive impairment that prevents her from doing voluntary movements. And she could not use our first solution, which was requiring focus, attention, to mind control the exoskeleton arm. So we came up with a solution that used the two things that Nathalie could do, which is blowing a kiss and having a big smile, in order to control the arm. And what you're going to see is what happened that day during the torch relay. We used a multimodal human-machine interface that was using her brainwaves, facial expressions, analyzed with computer vision thanks to a camera, in order to be able to control this exoskeleton arm and participate in the Olympic torch relay. This work would not have been possible without the partnership that Inclusive Brains has with Allianz Trade, a partnership that is not about the Olympic Games, that is about inclusion and safety in the workplace. Nathalie was able to use Prometheus BCI that Paul invented in order to live, I think, one of the most extraordinary moments of her life. Now, a little anecdote about that. The person that is pushing the wheelchair is her twin brother, Denis. We found out from the family a few days before the Olympic torch relay that Denis has autism and is afraid of crowd, which can be a bit problematic for an Olympic torch relay when you have tens of thousands of people along the road. So what did we do? We used our algorithms that monitor stress and the brain sensing earbuds to monitor Denis' stress level in real time, and if needed, to be able to communicate with him and tell him a few jokes, distract him, etc. So the technology was used there too. And because we're a bit cocky, not so long ago, we were on the stage of the United Nations AI for Good Summit, and Paul, that you see here, my co-founder, used Prometheus BCI to send a tweet that he just wrote with head movements and brainwaves to President Macron, who kindly replied, to let the world know that people can do that with invasive solutions, but we can do some pretty cool stuff with non-invasive solutions too, which is something that can help people at so many levels. And let me tell you about markets to end. We can use this technology for training, learning, upskilling, understanding whether people pay attention or not, and really tailoring the content that people are using in order to learn and to be upskilled. We work with the company Biotech Dental, that I chair the Institute for Artificial Intelligence, to monitor the stress level of patients during dental surgery. And we all know that stress in dental surgery is something that is quite common. To make sure that we can time better when to intervene and have the best outcomes. But also for the dental surgeon to monitor what is happening and to be interacting with some assistance that analyzes in which state the surgeon is. The first dental assistant that can not only provide information, but the information is adapted based on how the person interacting with the assistant is. You know, in a rush, time, etc. I think a more humane interaction. We also worked with the International Knee and Joint Center in Abu Dhabi for a world premiere where we recorded the brains and biosignals of 2 surgeons during surgery, orthopedic surgery, in order to understand better how they operate, when they are doing things that are routine compared to dealing with uncertainty and the unknown, because we're talking about people who perform several surgeries a day that have tremendous amount of pressure on their shoulders and whose performance can be altered and can be improved if we know better when for them to take a break and the cooperation mechanisms between them. Improving healthcare delivery outcomes based on evidence-informed technology. Which brings us to regulation. And we're going to talk about that in the following discussion. But regulation today, my call is for regulation to be realistic. I've been to too many committees, meetings, where people were saying, oh, one day neurotech is going to be allowing people to mind control a car. Yeah, we did it 7 years ago. One day we'll be able to monitor this or that. Well, these companies have been doing it. Regulation must be anchored in 2 things: evidence and multi-stakeholder approach. I mean, it would be crazy to regulate, again, something that is cardiac related without having experts in heart and cardiovascular systems. How come there are so few neuroscientists working in some of a regulatory process, not to mention from the private sector? And finally, technology and financial mechanisms on the market must be put in place for the tech to survive its inventors and the companies that have been producing it. as we're dealing with people who are vulnerable, who create or have a dependence on the technology, whatever it is. A lot of assistive technologies are developed these days by small companies with very little hopes to survive. What happens if the technology is adopted by a person whose life depends on the technology and the company goes belly up, bankrupt? So we're working with a bunch of people on financial mechanisms, such as if you fund the company, some of the funding should be blocked on bank accounts in order for customer support to survive a company. You know, when I was hired the first time in the US, one thing I asked is for money to be blocked on bank account to whatever happened to the company, they could pay me for a year. We need to do that in order to support this. The fact that technology has to survive its inventors, commercially as well. And I would like to thank the people without whom this would not have been possible. An initiative by the young global leaders of the World Economic Forum called Assistive Tech and Artificial Intelligence for Inclusion Impact Initiative. All of these people have been instrumental in bringing all of our projects together with Paul, especially Brooke Ellison, who's on the left, who co-founded the initiative with me and who left us earlier this year. I thank you very much for your attention.